Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Snoozy Scientist, where we wander gently through the deepest mysteries of our planet, one sleepy yawn at a time. Whether you're listening from your bed, wrapped in quiet blankets, or drifting through that gentle space where thoughts begin to blur, this calm spot has been made specially for you. A gentle space where curiosity and science sit side by side to help you relax. Tonight, we're traveling back far beyond the age of dinosaurs, long before mammals walked the land or birds filled the skies with song, even before the first buzzing of insects. We are going nearly 470 million years into the past to a time scientists call the Ordovician Period, a forgotten age when monsters ruled the seas. In this age, Earth was almost entirely covered in ocean. Nearly 85% of its surface was swallowed by water. The land lay barren and silent, nothing but bare rock and wind. But beneath the waves, it was anything but silent. Here, life had flourished into something astonishing, with creatures so strange, so alien, that even science struggles to capture their wonder. Imagine giant orthocones, squid-like hunters nearly 10 feet long, their straight shells gleaming as they drifted like living missiles, their tentacles like long ropes, snatching preys and dragging them into a beak strong enough to crack armor. On the seafloor below, trilobites scuttled in their thousands, armored like tiny tanks, their glittering crystal eyes among the most advanced vision of their time. All around them rose the very first coral reefs, teeming with bizarre forms of life that clung to fragile survival. It was an age of abundance, of life spilling into every niche the seas could offer. This was the world's first true age of monsters, a time when predators reigned over oceans that covered most of the earth. Then, in the blink of geological time, they all disappeared. But how could a world so full of creatures thriving in every corner collapse almost overnight? And what secrets does this forgotten age still hold for us today? Tonight, we'll drift softly into that ancient ocean. We'll follow the monsters that ruled it, the reefs that sheltered life, and the very first fish to evolve, the ancestors of everything with a backbone. But before we sink too deep into the past, I just want to take a moment to appreciate every one of you who have been drifting off to these videos, liking them and leaving thoughtful notes in the comments. Your support is what allows this little corner of calm to keep growing. Thank you. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. It's always a joy to see how far these sleepy stories drift across the world. So now, take a deep breath in, let it out slowly, and together let's sink into the Ordovician, the forgotten age of sea monsters. The Ordovician period began almost 485 million years ago and stretched across more than 40 million years of deep time. It was an age that is almost impossible to picture in human terms, a chapter so far removed from our present world that even the continents themselves were strangers. The land was clustered far to the south, joined together in fragments that scientists call Gondwana. This massive landmass was drifting slowly, pulled toward the chill of the South Pole, its movement across the planet changing the balance of seas and skies in ways that would ripple across all of life. On the surface of Earth, the land was stark and nearly barren. There were no trees, no grass, and no sound of animal footsteps. What little plant life existed was clinging in patches along damp shorelines, simple moss-like pioneers that hinted at the greening that would come much later. For now, the continents were quiet, covered mostly in bare rock and shifting sands, swept by winds under a sky rich in carbon dioxide. The atmosphere of the Ordovician was thick with this gas, far higher than today, and it trapped warmth across much of the planet. The world was generally hot and damp, its climate heavy and strange to modern eyes. Rainfall washed across empty coasts, carving rivers through naked stone and carrying minerals into the seas. Those seas were the true stage of life, covering nearly 85% of Earth's surface. From horizon to horizon they stretched, vast and unbroken, blue plains that held almost all the diversity and activity of the living world. It was within the shallow edges of these oceans that life gathered most abundantly. The continental shelves, those long stretches where the seafloor sloped gently away from the land, became cradles of biodiversity. Sunlight could reach through the clear waters, fueling the growth of algae and other primary producers. These, in turn, fed countless small organisms, building food webs that grew more complex with each passing epoch. The shallows were warm and nutrient rich, stirred by currents that carried oxygen and minerals. They formed natural laboratories where evolution could experiment endlessly. In these fertile zones, creatures competed for space, adapted to new roles, and expanded into niches that had never existed before. The reefs that would soon rise had their foundations here, first as scattered buildups of skeletal organisms, then as more elaborate structures that turned shallow seas into bustling underwater landscapes. The deeper waters, by contrast, remained quieter and more mysterious. Sunlight faded quickly with depth, leaving darkness and cold that only specialized forms of life could endure. The contrast between light-filled shallows and shadowed depths created gradients of opportunity, drawing some species upward to feed, while others retreated downward into safer hidden zones. The oceans of the Ordovician were not uniform, but layered worlds, each stratum carrying its own unique inhabitants. The air itself was different, not only thicker with carbon dioxide, but also under a fainter sun. The sun of the Ordovician shone with less strength than it does today, yet the greenhouse effect of the atmosphere kept much of the earth warm. The skies may have looked hazier, tinged by volcanic activity and the constant exchange of gases between sea and air. Clouds gathered and broke across the planet in patterns that are difficult to reconstruct, yet the evidence in rock and isotope points to a climate that was mostly humid and temperate, punctuated by shifts that were beginning to build toward great change. Gondwana's steady drift toward the pole shaped these conditions in subtle ways. As land moved southward, it changed ocean currents, altered weather systems, and rebalanced how heat was distributed across the planet. Though the continents themselves were largely lifeless, their movement was already beginning to set the stage for what would later become one of the most dramatic environmental crises in Earth's history. For now, however, the seas were filled with vitality, and life was finding new ways to expand and diversify. It is here, in these shallow and teeming waters, that the Ordovician world truly comes alive. What began as simple organisms in earlier ages had now blossomed into a dazzling variety of forms, filling every available niche. The oceans were not empty spaces, but intricate networks of predators and prey, builders and burrowers, grazers and hunters, each playing its part in a symphony of survival. And so the stage was set, with vast oceans, warm climates, and fertile shallows all combining to create conditions for something remarkable. Evolution was about to take one of its great leaps forward, unleashing a surge of diversity that would forever alter the shape of life on Earth. In the warm and shallow seas of the Ordovician, something extraordinary began to unfold. It was not a sudden event, like a single spark, but a gradual blossoming that spread across millions of years. Scientists call it the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event, and it marks one of the most dramatic expansions of life ever recorded in Earth's history. Where earlier oceans had been populated by relatively simple creatures, the Ordovician seas became crowded with astonishing variety. Tiny organisms multiplied into countless new forms, each one carving out a different way of surviving. In a span of time that seems vast to us, but brief in the language of geology, Life diversified into thousands upon thousands of new species. This was the moment when ecosystems became layered with complexity, with every niche tested, explored, and occupied by something new. The seafloor, once a relatively empty stage, grew busy with activity. Small worms tunneled through the mud, turning sediment into intricate mazes. Bryozoans, colonial creatures that resembled delicate lacework, began to spread, clinging to rocks and shells. Crinoids, relatives of modern sea lilies, stood like waving stalks anchored to the seabed, filtering food from the passing currents. Every corner of the ocean seemed to invite new experiments, and evolution answered with endless invention. Above these busy bottoms, the water column itself became alive with diversity. Plankton populations expanded, carrying energy upward into the food chain. Where once only a handful of drifters floated, there were now layers upon layers of life suspended in the currents, feeding the rise of larger creatures. These invisible clouds of microscopic organisms formed the foundation of entire ecosystems, ensuring that the oceans could support not just the small, but also the immense. Perhaps the most striking feature of this time was the appearance of coral reefs for the very first time in Earth's history. Before the Ordovician, reefs had been small and relatively simple, but now they grew into vast structures that transformed the seafloor into bustling underwater landscapes. Early corals, along with sponge-like stromatoporoids, pieced together skeletons of calcium carbonate, building walls and ridges that rose from the seabed like underwater mountains. These reefs created pockets of habitat, safe harbors where countless species could live side by side. Within the crevices of these new reef systems, life thrived in staggering variety. Mollusks grazed along their surfaces, echinoderms crawled across their slopes, and trilobites searched for shelter among their shadows. Predators lurked at the edges, waiting for a chance to strike, while tiny filter feeders clung to the ridges, capturing food from the currents. The reefs created opportunities that had never existed before, multiplying the number of ways life could evolve. As the reefs grew, they reshaped the flow of the ocean itself. Currents swirled differently, sediments settled in new patterns, and the chemistry of the water shifted. These changes created feedback loops, encouraging still more diversity. Every new form of life altered the environment just enough to open a door for something else to follow. It was as though the oceans themselves were becoming more intricate, woven with interactions that tied species together into a fragile but expanding web. The variety of creatures during this time is difficult to imagine fully. Shellfish of every shape spread across the seafloor, from brachiopods that looked like clams to bivalves that anchored themselves into the sand. Cephalopods with coiled or straight shells hunted above, their eyes watching from the dim light of the shallows. Starfish-like creatures and their relatives grew more elaborate, covering rocky outcrops. Even the earliest vertebrates, armored fish with simple forms, found their place among the growing complexity. This explosion of life was not uniform everywhere. Different regions of the oceans developed unique communities, shaped by currents, depth, and temperature. In some areas, trilobites dominated, filling countless ecological roles. In others, corals and crinoids created dense underwater gardens. This patchwork of habitats meant that the oceans of the Ordovician were not a single world, but many overlapping ones, each with its own character and rhythms. What makes this period so remarkable is not simply the increase in the number of species, but the depth of interaction among them. Food webs became longer and more intricate, with predators and prey locked into dynamic relationships that changed constantly. Symbiosis, competition, and cooperation all played their roles, binding species together in ways that would shape the future of evolution. It is easy to picture these seas as crowded theaters, filled with players of every size and role. Some creatures built, others grazed, many hunted, and all of them together formed the most complex ecosystems the Earth had yet seen. The oceans were no longer places of sparse survival, but thriving networks of interdependence, fragile in detail, yet resilient in their sheer abundance. And so the Ordovician seas swelled with life, richer and more varied than anything before. The world's oceans had become laboratories of invention, experimenting endlessly with form and function. From these crowded waters would rise the true monsters of the age, predators unlike any that had come before, waiting in the currents for their moment to strike. As the Ordovician seas grew crowded with new forms of life, a shadow passed over this abundance. Every thriving ecosystem invites hunters, and in these ancient oceans, the role of apex predator was claimed by creatures unlike anything alive today. They were the orthocones, straight-shelled cephalopods that became the missiles of their time. Each orthocone carried a long, tapering shell that could stretch the length of a grown human, gleaming like a polished spear as it moved through the water. Inside, chambers were filled with carefully regulated gases, giving the animal precise control over its buoyancy. With a subtle adjustment, it could rise or sink, holding itself steady in the water as though suspended on invisible strings. This ability allowed it to hover in silence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The body of the orthocone emerged from the open end of its shell, a cluster of strong tentacles surrounding a sharp, parrot-like beak. These tentacles stretched outward like ropes, each one lined with suckers or hooks that could grip struggling prey. When a fish or trilobite drifted too close, the orthocone would lash out in a sudden flurry of motion, coiling its arms around the victim and dragging it into the crushing strength of its beak. What appeared to be a drifting shell, passive and harmless, could in an instant become a weapon of terrifying speed. Their hunting style relied on patience and ambush. Orthocones did not need to chase their prey across the seas. Instead, they mastered stillness, blending into the dim light of the water until the moment came. Then, using a form of jet propulsion, they expelled water from a muscular siphon beneath their bodies, surging forward with sudden bursts of acceleration. These jets made them agile, able to dart and maneuver, and gave rise to the image of them as the first living torpedoes of the deep. The presence of such predators reshaped the balance of life in the Ordovician. Smaller creatures adapted behaviors to avoid their grasp. Trilobites burrowed into sediments or developed spines that made them harder to swallow. Fish, still in their earliest stages of evolution, kept close to the safety of reefs and shoals, yet even these defenses were never foolproof. Orthocones could strike from above, their tentacles reaching downward like falling snares, or they could surge upward from the shadows of the seafloor, catching their prey unaware. The eyes of the orthocones were sharp and unblinking, scanning their surroundings for the faintest movement. In a world where vision itself was still a relatively new evolutionary tool, their ability to see and respond with such speed made them dominant. To smaller animals, the gaze of an orthocone meant danger. To the reefs and communities of the shallows, it meant constant vigilance. These predators were not solitary in their reign. The Ordovician seas may have been filled with countless species, but the orthocones stood above them all, unmatched in their size, their cunning, and their reach. They were the rulers of a watery empire, drifting silently until the moment of violence arrived. To witness an ocean filled with them would have been to see forests of shells hanging in the water, each one hiding the deadly creature within. The dominance of the orthocones tells us something about the power of adaptation. By combining buoyancy control, jet propulsion, and a versatile array of tentacles, they became perfectly suited to the expanding ecosystems of the time. Their rise was not simply the appearance of a new hunter, but the arrival of a force that reshaped the behaviors, defenses, and survival strategies of nearly everything around them. The seas of the Ordovician, already vibrant with life, had now become places of tension as well as abundance. Every shimmering school of plankton feeding creatures existed under the watchful presence of shells gliding silently through the water. Every reef and seafloor community carried the constant risk of sudden predation. The orthocones brought with them an atmosphere of menace that gave the oceans their title as the first true age of monsters. And as life continued to diversify and reefs continued to rise, these apex predators held their place at the very top, shaping the destinies of creatures above and below them. The oceans had become kingdoms of abundance, but also of fear, and from here the story of survival only grew more intricate. Beneath the drifting shadows of the orthocones, the seafloor was alive with its own strange inhabitants, crawling across the sediments, climbing over reefs, and burrowing into shallow sands were the trilobites, a group of creatures that defined the Ordovician world as much as the great predators above them. They were armored in hard exoskeletons, their bodies divided into three long lobes that gave them their name. To modern eyes, they look alien, with ridges, spines, and patterns that seem more like the design of machines than the form of animals. Yet these were among the most successful creatures in Earth's history, enduring for hundreds of millions of years and leaving behind more than 20,000 known species. In the Ordovician seas, they were everywhere, filling roles as both predators and prey, survivors and victims, builders and scavengers. Some trilobites grew flat and wide, hugging the seafloor so closely they could almost vanish against the sand. Others developed elaborate spines, rising like thorns from their backs to make swallowing them a dangerous task. There were small ones that could scuttle into tiny crevices, and giants that reached lengths of more than 2 feet, lumbering slowly across the mud like armored tanks. Diversity was their strength, and evolution had carved them into countless shapes to meet the challenges of their world. Their most remarkable feature, however, was their eyes. Long before vertebrates developed complex vision, trilobites had mastered it. Their eyes were made not of soft tissues, but of crystal. Tiny lenses of calcite, a mineral also found in limestone and marble, were arranged in clusters, forming compound eyes with extraordinary sharpness. Each lens bent light in a slightly different way, allowing them to see across a wide field of view. Some trilobites had thousands of these lenses, turning their gaze into a mosaic of light and shadow, capable of detecting even the smallest movement in the dim Ordovician seas. These crystal eyes were so advanced that they remain among the most sophisticated visual systems ever developed by nature. They allowed trilobites to navigate reefs, spot predators looming in the water above, and chase down small prey that drifted or crawled too close. To imagine their perspective is to see a fractured but detailed world, a shimmering collage where danger and opportunity could appear from any angle. The seafloor they inhabited was far from still. Trilobites moved constantly, scuttling in great numbers, grazing on detritus, hunting tiny organisms, or burrowing into the sediments for safety. Some species formed schools, swarming together for protection, while others lived solitary lives, relying on their armor and spines to defend them. In death, many could roll into tight balls, tucking their legs inward like modern pill bugs, sealing themselves within their shells until the threat passed. Their role in the ecosystem was both varied and vital. Some were hunters, snapping at worms and softer-bodied creatures that shared the seabed. Others sifted through sediments, recycling nutrients and stirring the mud in ways that enriched the environment for countless smaller organisms. Many were prey themselves, falling victim to the swift strikes of cephalopods or the probing grasp of larger predators. Trilobites were at once the keepers of the seafloor and the fuel that kept the Ordovician food webs alive. The diversity of trilobites during this time is one of the great marvels of ancient life. Each region of the oceans developed its own unique species, adapted to the particular currents, sediments, and predators of that place. In shallow tropical waters, brightly spined trilobites guarded themselves among corals. In deeper, murkier seas, flatter species hugged the mud, where sight was less important than the ability to feel vibrations in the water. Some even developed strange ridges and protrusions that may have been used for display, recognition, or mating, hinting at behaviors more complex than we often imagine for such ancient creatures. They carried with them a sense of resilience. Wherever life could find a foothold, trilobites were there, adapting, changing, and thriving. Their crystal eyes sparkled in the light filtering down from above. Their armored shells scraped against stone, and their movements left trails across the sediments that hardened into fossils. Each track and fragment became a record, telling us of the endless activity that filled those long vanished seas. And yet, as rich as the seafloor it was only part of the story. The reefs rising above them, built from coral and sponge like organisms, were creating still more opportunities, weaving new environments into the oceans. Within these coral cities, different kinds of life began to gather, climbing upward from the foundations laid by creatures like the trilobites. From the armored inhabitants of the sediments, the story of life was already stretching toward new possibilities. While trilobites scuttled across the sea floor and cephalopods drifted like living torpedoes through the open water, another kind of creature was beginning its slow and quiet rise. They were small at first, often overlooked among the armored crawlers and the hunters that filled the seas. Yet within their bodies lay something entirely new, a framework that would one day shape every bird, mammal, reptile, and human that ever walked the earth. These were the first fish, the earliest vertebrates, and their story begins in the Ordovician seas. They were not yet the graceful swimmers we know today. These first fish had no jaws, no teeth, and no sleek forms designed for speed. Instead, they were simple, elongated animals, their bodies covered in protective plates of bone. The armor gave them strength against the dangers around them, turning their small frames into living shields. Some of these plates formed around the head, giving them the appearance of helmets, while the rest of their bodies remained softer, wriggling to push them gently through the water. Despite their simplicity, these fish carried inside them the beginnings of a spine. Their skeletons were not made of hard bone like ours, but of cartilage, flexible and light. Along their backs ran a rod called the notochord, a primitive support structure that made their bodies more controlled and coordinated than the soft-bodied animals that had come before. With this innovation, they could swim with a rhythm that was steadier, stronger, and more directed. It was a quiet step forward, but one that would change the course of life forever. In the Ordovician seas, they would have seemed modest compared to the trilobites with their crystal eyes, or the towering orthocones drifting above. Yet what they lacked in grandeur they made up for in potential. Their armor may have slowed them, but it protected them from predators. Their lack of jaws meant they fed by filtering particles from the water or by sucking nutrients from the soft mud. Still, they were survivors, carving out a living in an ocean already crowded with competitors. The sight of one of these fish would have been strange to modern eyes. Imagine a creature no longer than your hand, its head encased in a bony shield, its body trailing behind in a soft, flexible tail. It did not glide quickly like the fish we know today, but wriggled and pulsed, moving with a patient determination through the dim light of the shallows. Its eyes, small and watchful, scanned for food, while its gills pulled oxygen from the water. Every movement, every breath carried forward the blueprint of what vertebrate life would become. The arrival of these first fish marked a turning point in evolution. For the first time, The oceans held animals with backbones, however primitive. This simple structure allowed them greater coordination, stability, and control. It was an innovation that opened the door to endless possibilities. Over time, vertebrates would grow larger, stronger, and more complex. They would sprout jaws, fins, and eventually legs. But in the Ordovician, they were still quiet beginners, unaware that they carried the seeds of Earth's future dominion. What is most remarkable is that we can trace our own lineage back to these unassuming armored swimmers. Every vertebrate on Earth, from the smallest bird to the largest whale, shares a distant ancestry with these jawless pioneers. The bones in our bodies, the vertebrae that support us, even the skulls that protect our brains, all find their origin in the armored plates of these early fish. In their small frames, the foundation for all vertebrate life was written. The seas of the Ordovician were filled with predators and prey, builders of reefs and grazers of algae. Yet within the quiet persistence of these first fish was a story far greater than their size. They were the humble beginnings of a lineage that would one day crawl onto land, take to the skies, and shape the planet in ways no trilobite or orthocone ever could. In their armored silence, they carried the future, gliding slowly through shallow waters, unnoticed by the monsters around them. And as reefs continued to grow and the seafloor bustled with trilobites, these small vertebrates found their place among the shadows. They did not yet rule the oceans, but they were patient, biding their time. The story of the seas was still unfolding, layer upon layer, and new environments were rising from the reefs themselves, opening habitats that would harbor still more wonders. As the first armored fish wriggled through the shallows, a new kind of structure was beginning to rise from the seafloor. It was not built by stone or tectonic force, but by living creatures working slowly, cell by cell, over spans of time longer than any lifetime. These were the first great reefs, and they transformed the Ordovician oceans into places of complexity and wonder. The builders were corals and their sponge-like relatives called stromatoporoids. Together they began to stack their calcium carbonate skeletons into ridges and walls, layer upon layer, until entire underwater landscapes formed. At first they were small outcrops, patches of hard surface clinging to the sediment. But as the ages passed, these reefs grew larger, taller, and more intricate, turning stretches of seafloor into vibrant underwater cities. Unlike the shifting sands or the soft mud, reefs provided stability. They were solid, enduring structures that resisted the pull of currents and waves. This permanence made them magnets for life. Every ridge, every crevice, and every hollow became an opportunity for a creature to find shelter, food, or a place to anchor. What had once been a flat expanse of seafloor was now transformed into a vertical world of ledges and chambers where countless species could live side by side. The reefs quickly became ecological hotspots. They attracted grazers that fed on algae, filter feeders that sifted plankton from the currents, and predators that prowled the edges looking for prey. Mollusks clung to the surfaces, crinoids waved their feathery arms from crevices, and trilobites scurried across the slopes searching for food. Small fish hovered near the protection of the corals, finding safety in the labyrinth of hiding places. Even the jet-propelled orthocones were drawn to these areas, circling the perimeter like sentinels, for where there was abundance, there was always opportunity for a hunter. Every reef was a stage for interactions both fierce and delicate. Prey darted into gaps in the stone to avoid capture. Sessile animals grew over one another, competing for space and light. Some creatures evolved spines or armor to resist attack, while others relied on speed and stealth to survive in these crowded environments. The reef was not just a shelter, but a crucible of evolution, pushing species to adapt and innovate in order to endure. The corals and stromatoporoids that built these reefs were ancestors of the reef builders we know today. Yet their structures were simpler, their communities less stable. Still, they set the pattern that would echo throughout Earth's history. Modern coral reefs trace their lineage back to these pioneers, and the bustling ecosystems of today's tropics are a direct continuation of what began in the Ordovician seas. In many ways, these early reefs were experiments. Evolution was trying out new designs, testing which combinations of species could coexist and which roles could be sustained in such complex environments. The reefs altered water flow, changed how sediments were deposited, and created microenvironments of light and shadow. These subtle shifts opened the door to even more diversity, ensuring that once reefs appeared, they would never truly vanish from Earth's story. Imagine drifting across such a reef in the Ordovician world. The water would be warm and clear, carrying the faint shimmer of sunlight down into a city alive with movement. Crinoids swayed gently with the current, trilobites scurried between corals, and armored fish slipped quietly along the edges. Above, the looming shadow of an orthocone might glide past, while smaller shelled creatures clung tightly to the reef face, filtering nourishment from the passing flow. Every surface was occupied, every space filled with life trying to find its place. The reefs also offered opportunities for life to climb upward. For the first time, organisms could live above the seafloor, lifted into higher currents where food was more abundant. This vertical expansion of ecosystems was a quiet revolution, one that multiplied the possibilities of how life could live. No longer confined to flat sediments, creatures now inhabited a three-dimensional world of towers, ridges, and chambers. These ancient reefs were not permanent. Storms could break them apart, changes in sea level could drown them, and shifts in temperature or chemistry could slow their growth. Yet while they lasted, they shaped the Ordovician seas into something more intricate than anything that had come before. They were the blueprints for ecosystems that would reappear again and again in the history of life, each time bringing with them an explosion of diversity. And as reefs spread across the shallows, they created new arenas where the struggle between predator and prey could unfold in ever more complex ways. Within these coral strongholds, the arms race of evolution sharpened, setting the stage for an oceanic drama that would intensify with every passing epoch. As reefs rose and life multiplied across the Ordovician seas, the oceans became crowded stages of competition. Every niche filled with hungry mouths and fragile bodies, every crevice held both refuge and risk. With so much abundance came pressure. Predators grew sharper and more cunning, and prey in turn reshaped themselves into fortresses, hiding places, and armored walls. For the first time in Earth's history, the eternal struggle between attack and defense unfolded on a grand scale. The great cephalopods, the straight-shelled orthocones, perfected the art of ambush. Their tentacles, once simple tools for grasping, became more muscular, capable of tightening like ropes around their victims. Their beaks, made of hard keratin, grew powerful enough to crush the shells of brachiopods and mollusks that sought safety in armor. Even their jet propulsion became more efficient, allowing them to surge forward in bursts that left prey with no chance to flee. But the creatures they hunted did not remain passive. Many trilobites began to sprout longer and sharper spines, transforming their rounded shells into spiked fortresses that made swallowing them a dangerous task. Others flattened their bodies, slipping into the soft mud of the seafloor, hiding beneath a thin veil of sediment until danger had passed. Some developed the ability to roll tightly into balls, their legs tucked inward, their armored plates sealing shut like a locked chest. Shellfish, too, joined the contest. Brachiopods thickened their shells, layering calcium carbonate into stronger defenses. Gastropods coiled their shells more tightly, leaving fewer openings for attackers to exploit. Burrowers dug deeper into the seafloor, vanishing into hidden tunnels where even the most patient predator could not reach them. The reefs themselves became arenas for this arms race. Every ledge, every shadowed crevice was filled with creatures testing new strategies. Some species clung to vertical walls, just beyond the reach of many hunters. Others grew rapidly, producing vast numbers of offspring, so that even if many were eaten, enough would survive to continue their line. It was not only strength that mattered in these waters, but also speed, stealth, and sheer persistence. For the first time in Earth's history, ecosystems were shaped by direct conflict between hunters and their prey. Every improvement in offense was matched by an answer in defense. When predators developed stronger jaws, prey responded with thicker shells. When prey grew spines, predators refined their grip. This back and forth pushed evolution forward, driving the creation of new forms and strategies in a relentless cycle. The results were extraordinary. Creatures became more specialized than ever before. Some trilobites evolved elaborate eye structures, their crystal lenses multiplying in number, giving them nearly panoramic vision to detect danger from every direction. Predators, in turn, honed their senses, their eyes sharpening, their ability to sense vibrations in the water becoming keener. The seas grew louder with the silent signals of struggle, an invisible contest of awareness, timing, and speed. It was not always about size or strength. Sometimes the smallest adaptations made the greatest difference. A slightly deeper burrow could mean survival. A slightly faster escape could carry one fish away from the tentacles of a looming cephalopod. A tiny change in the shape of a shell could be the difference between being crushed and resisting the predator's beak. Over millions of years, these small shifts accumulated, sculpting bodies into new designs, filling the oceans with creatures more elaborate and better suited to their roles. The Ordovician oceans, once simple, were now layered in complexity. In the plankton-rich waters above, small organisms darted quickly to escape jaws snapping from below. Along the reef slopes, grazers nibbled carefully under the watchful eyes of hidden hunters. In the soft mud of the seabed, burrowers felt the tremors of danger above them and held still, trusting the earth to shield them. Life was no longer simply about existing, it was about staying one step ahead in a contest that never truly ended. This was nature's first great arms race, a cycle of adaptation and counter-adaptation that would repeat itself throughout all of history. It gave rise to sharper teeth, harder shells, keener senses, and quicker reflexes. It transformed the seas from quiet cradles of growth into battlefields of innovation, where survival was earned not by chance, but by constant change. And as this struggle deepened, the oceans themselves became more dynamic, more unpredictable, and more alive than ever before. From the silence of the seafloor to the shadowed corridors of the reefs, life was locked into its first great contest, and from that contest would emerge the foundations of the complex ecosystems that shaped the world to come. While the oceans of the Ordovician teemed with life, brimming with predators and prey, locked in their endless contest, the world above the waves told a very different story. The continents, clustered far to the south, were barren and empty. They were landscapes of rock and sand, broken by mountains and rivers but lacking the cover of forests or the softness of soil. To walk across such a land would have been to hear only the sound of wind, to see only stone and shadow, without the comfort of leaves or the call of animals. The surfaces of these continents were harsh, exposed to sunlight and storm without the shield of vegetation. Dust and sediment blew freely across plains, settling into valleys and drifting into shallow seas where it nourished the life below. Rain fell on naked stone, carving rivulets that rushed quickly into rivers and streams, unimpeded by roots or grasses. Without plants to anchor the earth, erosion was constant, reshaping the landscape in raw and restless cycles. It is difficult to imagine such silence today, when every modern landscape carries some sign of growth, from blades of grass to forests of towering trees. Yet in the Ordovician, the land was lifeless, a world still waiting for its invitation to be claimed. It was a stage set for colonization, but the actors had not yet arrived. Still, there were hints of change. Along the margins where land met sea, small moss-like plants began their quiet experiments. They were simple, lacking the true roots, stems, and leaves of later plants, but they clung to damp soils and rocky surfaces, drawing strength from water and sunlight. These pioneers were fragile, confined to the wettest places where they could remain moist, for without elaborate tissues to carry water, they dried quickly. Yet their presence marked a profound turning point. In their creeping mats, life was beginning to reach beyond the seas. For the first time, Earth's continents were touched by green. These plants stabilized small patches of soil, capturing sediments and slowing the erosion that had dominated the land for eons. They also released oxygen during photosynthesis, subtly shifting the balance of the atmosphere. Though they covered only a fraction of the landscape, they were early heralds of a transformation that would one day blanket continents in forests. Imagine standing on the edge of an Ordovician shore. Before you stretches an endless expanse of rock and sand, its surface glinting under the sunlight. Yet close to your feet, at the boundary where seawater meets land, you notice faint patches of green, delicate films of life clinging to the stone. It is a fragile foothold, barely visible compared to the abundance of the oceans, but it is a beginning. These first terrestrial plants depended heavily on the seas. Their spores spread in water, their growth limited to moist environments, their survival tied to the rhythms of tides and rainfall. They were not yet independent conquerors of the land, but rather cautious explorers, testing new ground. Each small advance opened possibilities, creating microhabitats where other life might one day follow. Yet for now, the continents remained mostly desolate. No animals had yet stepped ashore, no insects crawled through the soil, no birds wheeled overhead. The air was empty of sound, but filled with particles of dust and the tang of volcanic gases. The continents were waiting, vast and silent, as the oceans carried on as the center of all activity. From space, Earth would have looked strangely imbalanced. The deep blues of the oceans covered nearly 9/10 of the surface, while the continents lay bare and brown, clustered near the south, with only faint traces of green along the margins. It was a planet ruled by water, with land as little more than an afterthought. And so the Ordovician world unfolded in contrast. Beneath the waves, complexity deepened, predators sharpened, and reefs grew into thriving ecosystems. Above the waves, silence reigned, broken only by wind and rain. The continents waited in their stillness, barren stages destined one day to host forests, swamps, and creatures beyond imagining, but for now they remained empty, while the seas continued to hold the heartbeat of life. Far to the south, the continents of the Ordovician world were locked together in a single vast landmass that scientists call Gondwana. It was an immense supercontinent, stretching across thousands of miles, its shape dominating the face of the Earth. While most of the planet was covered in warm, shallow seas, Gondwana carried the weight of mountains, deserts, and coastlines that sprawled across the southern hemisphere. But Gondwana was not still. It drifted slowly, carried by the movement of the planet's plates, its journey measured not in years, but in millions of years. With each passing age, it crept farther southward, edging toward the cold emptiness of the South Pole. This drift was imperceptible to the creatures of the time, but it was relentless, and it would change the fate of the world. As Gondwana moved, its sheer size reshaped the circulation of the oceans. Currents that once flowed freely around the equator were redirected, forced to curve and twist around the continental mass. New coastlines altered wind patterns, drawing moisture to places where it had rarely fallen before. The climate began to tip, slowly and almost invisibly, into instability. At first, the world remained warm. The air was still heavy with carbon dioxide, and the seas were still rich with life. But the position of Gondwana created subtle shifts that would, over time, accumulate into something far greater. As the continent approached the pole, sunlight struck its southern edges at sharper angles, weakening the heat that reached its vast expanse. Winters grew longer in the far south, shadows stretched farther, and snow began to cling to the highest peaks. The seeds of ice were being planted. Small glaciers formed in isolated valleys, creeping downward like frozen rivers. At first, they were temporary, melting with the return of warmer seasons. But as Gondwana drifted still farther into polar latitudes, these glaciers lasted longer, thickening year by year. Their pale surfaces reflected sunlight back into the sky, cooling the air even further. A quiet feedback loop had begun, one that would eventually spiral into catastrophe. In the oceans, the signs of change were subtle but present. Currents carried cooler waters northward, mixing with the warm shallows where reefs thrived. Creatures adapted to steady warmth found themselves challenged by temperatures that shifted more often, sometimes falling below what they had long endured. Life continued to diversify, but beneath the richness of the seas, pressure was building. To imagine this moment in Earth's history is to picture a world balanced on the edge of transformation. On the surface, nothing seemed to have changed. Orthocones still hunted in silence. Trilobites still crowded the seafloor. Coral reefs still built their stone cathedrals in shallow waters. But beneath the waves, the slow turning of the planet and the steady march of Gondwana were weaving threads of change that would one day pull these ecosystems apart. The barren land of Gondwana, though lifeless compared to the seas, played a role larger than any creature could have imagined. As snow and ice gathered along its southern edges, they began to reshape the planet's climate on a global scale. What began as local cooling would spread outward, altering rainfall, sea levels, and the chemistry of the oceans. The Ordovician was entering a period of fragility, even as its reefs and monsters appeared to thrive. The drifting of Gondwana reminds us of the vast timescales at which the Earth moves. A continent's slow journey, invisible to the creatures of its day, can hold the power to alter entire climates, to silence once thriving ecosystems, and to set in motion a cascade of events that ripple across millions of years. In the Ordovician, those ripples were only just beginning to stir, and as ice quietly took root in the far south, the skies themselves were different from the ones we know today, holding clues to the strangeness of this ancient world. While Gondwana crept steadily southward, the world above it was cloaked in a sky that would seem almost unrecognizable to modern eyes. The Ordovician atmosphere was thick with volcanic gases, filled with carbon dioxide at levels many times higher than those of today. The air itself would have felt heavier, with a tang of sulfur drifting from eruptions that dotted the continents. Volcanoes were common across the Earth, their plumes releasing ash and gases that spread into the upper layers of the sky, scattering light and veiling the sun in a faint haze. The sun itself was different. In this chapter of Earth's history, our star shone with less strength than it does now. Scientists call this puzzle the faint young sun paradox. The sun of the Ordovician radiated only about 4/5 of the energy it provides today. By all logic, such a dimmer sun should have left the Earth frozen, yet the planet was warm, its seas alive with reefs and its waters crowded with trilobites, cephalopods, and fish. The answer lay in the sky. The thick blanket of greenhouse gases trapped heat, keeping the oceans temperate and the climate suitable for the flourishing of life. The balance was delicate. Volcanic eruptions constantly added carbon dioxide to the air, while the weathering of rocks and the burial of organic matter pulled it slowly back out. At times, the skies would have appeared hazier than we are used to, with clouds shaped by different chemistry and particles scattering sunlight in unfamiliar colors. Beneath these skies, the seas absorbed vast amounts of carbon, carrying it into sediments where it would be stored for millions of years. The light of the Ordovician world was softer, tinged by the haze that hung across the atmosphere. The horizons might have seemed more muted, the sunsets deeper and more drawn out as particles refracted the dimmer rays of the sun. The combination of weaker sunlight and a thicker carbon-rich sky created a world that glowed in tones unlike anything familiar to us. The seas beneath this alien sky were warmer than we might expect from a faint star. They carried heat across vast distances, stirred by currents reshaped by Gondwana's bulk. In the tropics, shallow waters would have shimmered with warmth, cradling the growth of coral reefs and fueling the explosion of biodiversity. Storms swept across the surface, heavy with moisture evaporated from those warm seas, drenching barren continents before rushing back into the oceans again. Life was shaped not just by the oceans and the continents, but by the character of the skies themselves. The hazy atmosphere filtered sunlight in ways that affected the photosynthetic organisms at the base of the food web. Algae and plankton adapted to the quality of light available, capturing energy and building the foundation for the ecosystems that thrived above them. Every trilobite scuttling along the seafloor and every orthocone hunting in silence owed its existence to the invisible partnership between a faint sun and a thick atmosphere. The air may also have carried more oxygen than before, the result of photosynthesis surging in the oceans. This would have allowed animals to grow larger and more active, fueling the rise of powerful predators and more complex food chains. Yet the higher levels of other gases like carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide would have made the air itself feel different, perhaps harsher to breathe had we been there to test it. To stand on the shore of an Ordovician sea and look upward would have been to witness a sky filled with both familiarity and strangeness. Clouds drifted, storms gathered, lightning flashed, but the light filtering down felt gentler, dimmer, and the colors painted across the heavens were richer and stranger than those we know. It was the same sun, the same sky, yet softened by chemistry and distance, turned into something alien by time. Under this sky, Earth was balanced on the edge of change. The warmth that allowed life to flourish was sustained only by the fragile interplay of gases, currents, and sunlight. A slight shift could tip the balance toward cooling or warming, and already Gondwana's southward drift was beginning to disturb that equilibrium. For now the seas remained rich and alive, but in the pale light above them, the first hints of instability were beginning to gather. Beneath the hazy skies of the Ordovician, the oceans continued to brim with predators that had long ruled without challenge. The straight-shelled cephalopods, the orthocones, glided silently through the water, their tentacles poised, their beaks sharp enough to shatter armor. For millions of years, they had been the unchallenged masters of the seas, their patience and precision making them the top predators of their time. Yet evolution does not rest, and even the greatest hunters eventually meet rivals. In the midst of the biodiversity that filled the reefs and shallows, a new kind of fish began to emerge. Unlike the jawless armored fish that had crept quietly through the Ordovician seas. These pioneers carried a revolutionary weapon. They possessed jaws, and with them came the ability to bite, to grasp, and to tear. This was more than an adaptation, it was a transformation that would alter the balance of power in the oceans forever. At first, these jawed fish were modest in size, nothing compared to the looming bulk of an orthocone. They moved with wriggling strokes, their skeletons still made of cartilage, light and flexible, allowing them quick bursts of speed, yet their jaws gave them an edge no other creature had possessed before. Instead of straining food from the water or scraping from the mud, they could actively seize prey, gripping it with firm bites and consuming it more efficiently. Each meal became easier to capture, each strike more effective. For the orthocones, accustomed to hunting creatures that could flee or hide but not bite back, this was a new kind of opponent. The jawed fish could fight, and though they were smaller, their numbers grew steadily. With every generation, they became faster, more agile, and more versatile in what they could eat. In the crowded arenas of the reefs, they could dart quickly among coral ridges, snapping up small invertebrates or chasing down slower fish. Their presence began to shift the dynamic of the ecosystem, forcing other creatures to adapt in turn. It was not only their jaws that made them formidable, their bodies carried paired fins, which gave them greater control over their movements. They could turn more sharply than the long, rigid orthocones, and they could pursue prey with greater accuracy. These new features, simple as they may seem, allowed them to thrive in environments that were too complex or narrow for the larger cephalopods to dominate. In the shelter of the reefs, they claimed niches that had once been beyond the reach of the old apex predators. This did not mean the orthocones disappeared. They remained powerful hunters, unmatched in open waters where their size and strength gave them the advantage. But the oceans were no longer theirs alone. A shift in the balance had begun, subtle but undeniable. For the first time, vertebrates with jaws were rising as true competitors, and their innovations would ripple across the rest of Earth's history. Imagine the tension of these waters. A trilobite scuttles across the seafloor, only to be seized by the sudden strike of a jawed fish, its armored plates crushed with ease. Above, an orthocone hovers in silence, waiting to ambush the fish itself, its tentacles reaching forward in a deadly embrace. Each predator now had to watch not only for prey, but also for rivals. The food webs of the Ordovician were becoming layered with complexity as hunters hunted hunters and power shifted from one lineage to another. The rise of the jawed fish was not a single moment, but a gradual story unfolding across millions of years. Each small change, each sharper jawline, each stronger fin brought them closer to dominance. In time, their descendants would grow larger and more fearsome, some reaching lengths of many meters, their jaws bristling with teeth. But even in these early stages, the pattern was clear. Evolution had introduced a new kind of predator, and with it, the certainty that the seas would never again belong to one group alone. And as this struggle deepened, biodiversity continued to peak, life filling every corner of the oceans until it seemed unstoppable. The reefs were bustling, the seas alive with rivals and prey, and Earth appeared to be entering a golden age. Yet beneath the surface of this abundance, changes in climate and currents were gathering strength, preparing to test the resilience of even the most powerful hunters. With reefs rising high and predators testing the limits of their power, the Ordovician world entered what can only be described as a golden age of life. The oceans had never been so full, so diverse, or so alive with interaction. From the shallow shelves that ringed the continents to the deeper basins of the open seas, creatures of every shape and size pressed into every possible role The coral and stromatoporoid reefs grew vast and elaborate, spreading into underwater fortresses that stretched for miles. Their surfaces were crowded with creatures that grazed, clung, burrowed, and hunted in miniature dramas played out beneath the gentle sway of currents. Crinoids lifted their stalks toward the light, filtering food drifting in the water. Bryozoans encrusted the rocky faces, their delicate colonies resembling tiny lacework. Bivalves, brachiopods, and gastropods carpeted the floors and crevices, their shells gleaming as they filtered nourishment from the flow. Above these reefs swam schools of fish, still small and modest by modern standards but growing bolder with each generation. Some were jawless, their heads plated in bone that gave them the look of tiny armored knights. Others had jaws, still primitive, but powerful enough to snap up worms and softer-bodied prey. Though diminutive, they darted with purpose, weaving through coral towers and slipping into narrow channels that larger hunters could not reach. The trilobites continued their reign across the seafloor, their numbers swelling into countless varieties. Some wore crowns of spines that bristled from their backs, others flattened their bodies to blend into the mud, while still others developed intricate eyes that sparkled with crystal lenses. In some regions, trilobites gathered in enormous groups, forming vast clusters that marched across sediments in synchronized swarms. Their fossilized trails remain today, carved into stone as though the seafloor itself remembers their movements. The orthocones still ruled the open waters, their long shells gliding silently, their tentacles poised for the strike. They were the lurking giants of the mid-ocean, watching with unblinking eyes as schools of fish and clusters of trilobites moved below. With sudden bursts of jet propulsion, they surged forward, wrapping prey in coils of muscle before breaking it apart with their powerful beaks. These cephalopods, patient and deadly, remained symbols of dominance, their shadowy presence shaping the lives of everything around them. Yet their dominion was no longer uncontested. The new-jawed fish, though smaller, were agile and relentless, capable of turning more sharply and navigating the crowded reefs with ease. They nipped at opportunities where the orthocones could not follow, snapping up prey hidden within coral hollows. They were rivals, not yet supreme but rising, their jaws promising a future where the balance of power would shift once again. Every corner of the ocean seemed alive with possibility. The shallow tropical shelves were filled with coral gardens. The cooler waters of higher latitudes supported their own communities, rich with brachiopods and trilobites adapted to colder conditions. Even the deeper zones, once thought inhospitable, hosted creatures that survived in the dim light, feeding on the rain of organic matter that drifted down from above. This was life at its zenith, a time when ecosystems were layered and interwoven more intricately than ever before. The food webs stretched higher and wider, with predators preying on predators and grazers feeding on ever more abundant algae and plankton. Species evolved to fill roles so specific that they depended entirely on the success of the reef or the currents of the sea. The oceans had become not just cradles of life, but complex theaters where every niche was occupied and every survival strategy tested. To imagine this world is to picture a sea glowing with activity. Sunlight streamed through clear waters, illuminating forests of coral and swarms of animals moving in synchrony. On the seafloor, trilobites shuffled and grazed, leaving rippled trails behind them. In the open water, schools of fish shimmered like liquid silver, darting in sudden bursts to avoid the silent approach of a predator. And high above, the orthocones drifted like living spears, ever watchful, their long shells cutting through the water with quiet authority. In this golden age, life appeared unstoppable. The seas, covering nearly 9/10 of the Earth's surface, were crowded with innovation and vitality. Every generation of creatures added new layers of complexity, new adaptations, new experiments in survival. It was a time of triumph, a moment when life flourished, as though the oceans could sustain abundance forever. Yet even as this richness unfolded, subtle changes stirred in the background. The position of Gondwana, the cooling hints at the poles, the delicate balance of gases in the air, all lingered quietly, unnoticed by the trilobites, scuttling on the seafloor or the predators drifting above. For now, though, the ocean seemed endless and eternal, filled with creatures that carried the story of life into its most dazzling chapter yet. The Ordovician seas shimmered with abundance, reefs bustling with life, predators gliding in silent ambush, and trilobites scuttling in countless forms. To the creatures of that time, it must have seemed as though the oceans would remain full forever. Yet far to the south, on the immense landmass of Gondwana, a change had begun that would slowly unravel the richness of the seas. The continent had drifted steadily into polar latitudes, and with its presence at the South Pole, the climate began to shift. Snow that once melted with the return of summer now lingered on mountaintops. Small glaciers thickened and crept downslope, each year adding layers of frozen water that refused to retreat. What began as patches of ice in lonely valleys soon grew into sheets that stretched across the land, reflecting the weak sunlight back into space. With every expansion, the earth cooled further, reinforcing the spread of the frozen shield. The glaciers of Gondwana were relentless. They crept across plains, grinding stone into dust, carving deep troughs, and burying the land beneath kilometers of ice. This white mantle transformed the balance of the planet. As more water froze on land, sea levels began to fall. The shallow seas that had nurtured so much life began to shrink, their waters retreating away from the continental shelves where biodiversity had once flourished. In the tropics, reefs that had stretched for miles were left exposed to the air. Coral colonies died as waters withdrew, their delicate structures drying and crumbling under the sunlight. Vast stretches of seafloor, once alive with trilobites, brachiopods, and crinoids, became barren mudflats. The habitats that had formed the beating heart of Ordovician life vanished as the oceans receded. For the creatures of the shallows, the change was devastating. Trilobites that had scuttled across coral ridges suddenly found themselves stranded in drying pools. Brachiopods that had once filtered nourishment from gentle currents were left gasping as the waters receded beyond their reach. Even the small armored fish, whose survival depended on the protection of reef structures, struggled to adapt as their refuges collapsed around them. The fall of sea levels also reshaped the chemistry of the oceans. Currents shifted, temperatures dropped, and nutrient flows were disrupted. Species finely tuned to the warmth of stable waters faced sudden cold, their delicate balances broken. In the deeper basins, cooler waters spread, chilling regions that had long been stable havens. Above the seas, the skies told their own story. With so much sunlight reflected by the ice, global temperatures dropped further. Storms intensified, rainfall patterns shifted, and the atmosphere itself carried the signals of a world tipping into crisis. For the first time in hundreds of millions of years, Earth was entering an ice age that touched every level of life. The animals living through these changes could not have understood the scale of what was happening, but the fossil record preserves their struggle. Species disappeared abruptly from sediments, their shells and remains ceasing in layers where they had once been abundant. Coral reefs collapsed, their intricate structures reduced to broken fragments. Trilobite lineages that had once thrived in variety dwindled, leaving only scattered survivors. The golden age of abundance was being undone not by predators or rivals, but by the slow, implacable spread of ice across a distant continent. Gondwana's frozen grip drew the oceans back, silenced the reefs, and stripped the shallows of their richness. Yet the story of this collapse was not finished. The Earth, as it has always done, would swing from one extreme to another, and the glaciers of Gondwana carried within them the seeds of a second catastrophe, one that would follow as swiftly as the first. As Gondwana's glaciers spread and sea levels fell, the thriving world of the Ordovician oceans began to falter. What had been an age of abundance, with reefs stretching for miles and predators ruling with confidence, was suddenly brought to the edge of collapse. This was not a fleeting disturbance, but a crisis of such scale that it reshaped the course of life forever. The Ordovician ended not in quiet decline, but in the first great dying, a catastrophe that erased nearly 85% of all species on Earth. The coral reefs were among the first to crumble. Their builders, the early corals and stromatoporoids, had flourished in warm, shallow seas that offered sunlight and nutrients in balance. But as waters withdrew and temperatures dropped, their fragile structures were left exposed or drowned in cold currents. Entire reef systems withered, their bustling ecosystems silenced. The coral gardens that had once been centers of innovation and shelter vanished, leaving only skeletal remains embedded in stone. The Trilobites, those armored wanderers of the seafloor, suffered deeply. Lineages that had branched into thousands of shapes were suddenly pruned. Spined forms that had once deterred predators found no defense against changing seas. Flat-bodied species that had hugged the sediments were buried under shifting mud as currents altered their patterns. Even the crystal-eyed varieties, whose vision had once scanned for danger with unmatched precision, could not adapt to the cold and scarcity that followed. Many entire groups of trilobites disappeared forever, leaving behind only fragments of their once great diversity. Brachiopods, which had blanketed the seafloors in enormous numbers, dwindled as well. Their shells, once filters of nourishment from flowing currents, closed in futility as plankton supplies faltered. Crinoids toppled from their stalks, unable to hold on in waters that no longer carried the food they needed. Bryozoans, delicate lace-like builders, retreated into obscurity. Every corner of the ecosystem felt the weight of change, from the smallest burrowers to the apex predators themselves. Even the mighty Orthocones, rulers of the open seas, could not escape the consequences. Their jet-propelled strikes and powerful beaks had made them unstoppable hunters, yet without prey in abundance, their reign faltered. The food chains that had sustained them unraveled, leaving the giants adrift in oceans that could no longer provide enough to support them. For creatures that had once defined the image of Ordovician dominance, the silence of hunger was a final blow. The collapse was not a single moment, but a series of cascading losses. As one species disappeared, others that depended on it followed. Food webs fractured, leaving survivors in isolation. The richness that had defined the oceans only millions of years earlier was replaced by emptiness, layer after layer of sediment recording the sudden disappearance of life. Fossil beds that once overflowed with shells and corals thinned into stark gaps, silent testimony to the scale of the catastrophe. In some places, the devastation was total. Regions that had once teemed with reef systems became deserts of stone, barren and lifeless. In others, a handful of hardy survivors clung on, generalists able to tolerate change better than specialists. Cold-water species found new opportunities, spreading into niches abandoned by those that had fallen. But these were exceptions, sparks of endurance within a landscape of loss. To imagine the Ordovician seas at this moment is to picture silence after abundance. Where once trilobite swarms marched across the mud, their tracks crisscrossing in endless patterns, now there were only scattered shells. Where reefs had risen into underwater fortresses, now there were only broken fragments, their builders gone. The predators that had glided with confidence now drifted in hunger, their dominance hollow. This was the first time in Earth's history that life faced such a global reckoning. Nearly 9 out of every 10 species vanished, erased not by sudden impact or fire from the sky, but by the slow and relentless force of ice, cold, and retreating seas. It was a test of survival written into the very chemistry of the oceans, one that many failed and only a few endured. And yet, even within this vast loss, there were survivors, small, unassuming species that weathered the cold and scarcity, would carry life forward into the next chapters. But before recovery could begin, the crisis would take another turn, for the ice that had gripped the world would not hold forever. And when it melted, the oceans would face a second catastrophe. For millions of years, the straight-shelled cephalopods had glided as undisputed rulers of the Ordovician seas. They were the giants of their age, armed with long tapering shells that stretched for meters, jet propulsion that made them the first true missiles of the ocean, and tentacles that could coil and crush. Their reign had been unchallenged, their shadows striking fear into every creature beneath them. Yet even the greatest predators cannot escape the forces of the earth itself. As glaciers spread across Gondwana and sea levels fell, the very foundations of their power were stripped away. The shallow seas where prey had thrived retreated, shrinking into smaller and smaller areas. Reefs collapsed, the bustling gardens of coral and stromatoporoids disappearing into silence. Trilobite populations, once so abundant, dwindled to fragments of their former diversity. With every habitat that vanished, the food supply of the orthocones weakened. Their dominance was not ended by rival hunters, but by the slow collapse of the ecosystems that had sustained them. In the open oceans, these cephalopods still drifted with silent precision, but their strikes grew less frequent. The once rich shoals of fish and swarms of trilobites were no longer there in such numbers. Their tentacles reached into emptiness more often than into the writhing struggles of captured prey. For a predator that relied on abundance, scarcity was a wound from which they could not recover. Their size, once the key to their supremacy, became a burden. Large bodies required large meals, and in times of plenty, that need had been easily met. But as the climate shifted and the seas withdrew, such meals became rare. The energy needed to move their shells, to propel themselves through the water with bursts of jet propulsion, was immense. In lean times, the very traits that had made them apex predators turned into chains dragging them toward collapse. Smaller creatures proved more resilient. Some fish, jawless and jawed alike, required less food and adapted more readily to new niches. Trilobite survivors shifted into colder waters, their smaller forms better suited to endurance. But the orthocones, once the symbols of unstoppable power, found themselves starved by a world that no longer supported their reign. The fossil record shows their decline. Where once their shells were common in sediments, marking the presence of hunters across the globe, they become scarcer in the layers that followed. Their long shadows faded from the story of the oceans, not erased in a moment of sudden violence, but dimmed slowly as the environment around them transformed beyond what they could endure. To imagine their fall is to picture seas that grew emptier with each passing age. An orthocone hovers in the dim light, its tentacles poised, its eyes searching, yet its prey is gone. Hunger drives it forward in bursts, its siphon expelling jets of water, but each surge brings no reward. Around it, the silence of the ocean grows heavier. Where once it had ruled over a kingdom of abundance, it now drifts through emptiness, its dominance reduced to memory. This was the fate of many giants of the Ordovician. Their undoing came not from rivals rising to take their place, but from the planet itself shifting beneath them. Climate is the most unforgiving of adversaries, and even the most perfect predator cannot outlast the disappearance of its prey. The Orthocones, masters of stealth and strength, were brought low by ice, cold, and the retreat of seas. Their fall left the oceans forever changed. The apex predators of the Ordovician seas, the symbols of terror and power, became relics of a world that no longer existed. And in their absence, new survivors, smaller and more adaptable, began to take hold, reshaping the path of evolution as the Earth staggered through its first mass extinction. As the great cephalopods drifted into decline and the reefs collapsed into silence, the Ordovician oceans did not go completely empty. Life has always had a way of clinging to the edges of catastrophe, finding footholds in the most unlikely of places. But those who endured were not the giants or the specialists, finely tuned to the delicate balances of a vanished world. Instead, survival favored the generalists, those creatures with broad diets, flexible habitats, and simple but adaptable strategies. The collapse of biodiversity created a patchwork of opportunities and losses. Specialists, which had thrived during the Golden Age, found themselves trapped. Coral builders that required warm, shallow waters vanished when those seas retreated. Trilobites designed for life in narrow niches, with elaborate spines or unique feeding strategies, disappeared when the reefs and seafloors they depended on shifted into something unfamiliar. Creatures that had evolved to flourish in stability were undone when the rhythms of climate and current were broken. Generalists, on the other hand, could bend where others shattered. Some trilobite lineages, small and unspecialized, managed to persist by feeding on a wide variety of detritus and organisms, shifting their diets as ecosystems changed around them. Certain brachiopods, though diminished, clung to survival by tolerating a range of temperatures and water depths. Scavengers that could make use of whatever food remained fared better than hunters that relied on abundance. Cold water species, already adapted to harsher conditions, found new strength as the planet cooled. Where warm water trilobites and corals collapsed, organisms that had long endured chillier seas were able to expand into the empty spaces. They had been confined to narrower ranges during the warmth of the Ordovician peak, but as glaciers advanced and temperatures dropped, the world tilted in their favor. These survivors crept cautiously into niches left behind, not thriving in abundance, but enduring in persistence. The small jawless fish, modest and armored in plates of bone, also managed to persist through the crisis. They did not rely on reefs for protection and could survive in a variety of waters, filtering food and grazing where they could. Their humble size and broad tolerance carried them through when larger, more demanding creatures could not endure. They were not dominant, but they carried within them the lineage that would one day give rise to vertebrates of every kind, from amphibians to mammals. The story of survival during the first great dying was not one of triumph, but of fragility. The oceans were quieter, emptier, with only scattered life persisting in the shadows of what had been. Imagine a seafloor once bustling with trilobite swarms, now marked only by the occasional small survivor, scuttling alone across barren sediments. Picture a reef once alive with corals and crinoids, now reduced to rubble, where only a handful of hardy filter feeders cling to survival in cold currents. The abundance of the Golden Age was gone, replaced by a ghost world where endurance meant doing more with less. The fossils that remain tell us this story with silence as much as with presence. Whole lineages disappear abruptly from the record, their shells and skeletons ceasing in layers of stone. In their place, we see only the modest traces of survivors, species that endured not because they were strongest or most advanced, but because they were flexible, unassuming, and capable of surviving in environments stripped of richness. The lesson written into these rocks is clear. In times of crisis, specialists often falter, their strengths turning into vulnerabilities when the world changes too quickly. Generalists, able to adapt to shifting food sources and habitats, are the ones that endure. Cold water species, once confined to the margins, expand into the emptiness left behind. And through these quiet survivors, life continues its story, fragile but unbroken. Yet the trials of the Ordovician were not over. The glaciers that had gripped Gondwana would not last forever, and when they began to melt, the oceans would swing into a second catastrophe. For the survivors who had clung to existence in the cold, an entirely new challenge was about to surge from the return of the seas. The Ordovician world had already been reshaped by the advance of ice. Glaciers sprawled across Gondwana, seas retreated, and life struggled to endure in the shrinking shallows. For a time, the survivors adapted to the cold, clinging to existence in diminished ecosystems, but the earth, restless and unpredictable, did not hold its frozen grip forever. In a shift as sudden as the freezing that had begun it, the Ice Age collapsed, and the world lurched once again into chaos. The glaciers that had stretched for thousands of miles began to retreat. Their immense walls, built over millions of years, melted with astonishing speed as the climate warmed. Vast rivers of meltwater poured across the land, carving channels and valleys, carrying sediments into the seas. The oceans, once shrunken and withdrawn, surged back toward the continents. Shorelines raced inland, drowning plains and sweeping over areas that had only recently been carved by retreating waters. The rising seas did not simply restore the world as it had been. They transformed it into something new and unstable. Fresh water from the melting glaciers poured into the oceans, disrupting salinity and altering currents. Nutrient flows shifted again, overturning fragile balances. Species that had endured the scarcity of the cold suddenly found themselves overwhelmed by change of another kind, drowned not by emptiness, but by abundance rushing back too quickly. For the reefs, which had collapsed in the first crisis, there was no immediate recovery. The corals and stromatoporoids that might have rebuilt were already weakened, and the sudden flooding buried many of their remnants under layers of sediment. New reefs would one day rise, but in this moment, the seas that returned were murky and unsettled, churning with silt and debris from the melting of continents. Trilobites, already diminished, faced yet another trial. Those that had adapted to colder waters now found themselves exposed to warming seas and changing chemistry. Populations that had barely survived the freeze were struck again as their habitats shifted in ways they could not withstand. Some lineages disappeared entirely in these turbulent waters, unable to find refuge in ecosystems that transformed faster than they could adapt. Even the small armored fish, whose persistence had carried them through the advancing glaciers, struggled against the flood. Their shallow habitats were inundated, and competition returned in force as surviving species crowded into the same environments. Abundance, while it might seem like salvation, brought with it new challenges. Predators multiplied quickly, feeding on the sudden richness, and prey species could not always keep pace with the resurgence. The world had flipped from scarcity to excess, and the adjustment was as deadly as the freeze itself. To picture this moment is to imagine the earth groaning under the release of so much water. The glaciers collapsed into torrents that roared across the land, filling basins, drowning valleys, and raising seas higher than they had stood in ages. Coastal regions that had once been deserts of stone were swallowed again by waves. In the oceans, currents churned with new energy, mixing warm and cold waters into patterns unseen for millions of years. The survivors of the first catastrophe had been creatures of endurance, able to tolerate scarcity and cold. Now they were forced into a different kind of test, one of adaptability to chaos and sudden change. Few lineages were prepared for both extremes. Generalists once again fared better than specialists, but even many of them were caught in the whiplash of environments swinging from ice to flood. The fossils record this second blow in abrupt disappearances, species vanishing not gradually, but all at once, buried under sediments laid down in surging seas. The Ordovician oceans had gone from golden abundance to icy silence, and now to tumultuous flooding, all within a span of time that was brief compared to the long calm of earlier ages. It was a double strike, a 1-to-2 catastrophe that reshaped the planet with unforgiving force. Life had endured the freeze, but the sudden melt swept away many of those fragile survivors, leaving the world once again in ruins. And in the wake of this devastation, ecosystems struggled to stabilize, but the blow was too deep. Entire communities were erased, leaving only scattered remnants to hint at the richness that once had been. The Earth had delivered its first great extinction, not in a single strike, but in 2 crushing waves, freeze and flood, each one unraveling the delicate web of life that had flourished in the Ordovician seas. The Ordovician world was not undone by a single strike, but by 2 in quick succession. First came the freeze, as Gondwana slid over the South Pole and glaciers spread across the vast continent. Seas withdrew, shallow waters dried, and reefs collapsed into silence. Life staggered, pressed into narrow refuges where only the most adaptable could endure the cold. For millions of years, survival was reduced to endurance, as species clung to what little remained. Then, before recovery could take hold, the balance flipped. The ice sheets that had smothered Gondwana began to melt. Water, locked away for ages, poured back into the seas. Ocean levels surged higher and faster than ecosystems could adjust. What had been a world of scarcity was drowned in excess. Those that had endured the cold now faced a flood of challenges they were not prepared to meet. This double blow was more than ecosystems could absorb. Life thrives on balance, on rhythms of temperature, currents, and food chains that settle into stability over time. But in the late Ordovician, there was no chance for equilibrium. Just as organisms adapted to one extreme, the world lurched violently in the other direction. Freeze gave way to flood, and the survivors of the first trial were swept away by the second. The devastation played out in every corner of the oceans. Trilobites, once numbering in thousands of species, had already been thinned by the advancing ice. Those few that had managed to adjust to the cold were struck down when warming waters spread and habitats drowned under sediment. Coral reefs, stripped bare by retreating seas, had no time to rebuild before the floods buried their remnants beneath layers of silt. The orthocones, weakened by scarcity, found themselves adrift in unstable waters where prey disappeared altogether. Even small fish, hardy and adaptable, could not escape the disruption of food webs unraveling all around them. The chemistry of the oceans shifted as well. Fresh water from the melting glaciers diluted salinity, changing conditions for plankton at the foundation of the food chain. Nutrients poured into the seas in sudden excess, fueling algal blooms that may have consumed oxygen and suffocated the waters. In some regions, vast stretches of ocean may have turned anoxic, killing off animals that could not swim away from the spreading suffocation. It was not simply temperature or sea level that changed, but the very character of the seas themselves. This 1 to 2 punch secured extinction on a scale never before seen. Nearly 9 out of every 10 species vanished, their entire histories ending in a geological instant. Fossil beds record this collapse in stark detail, layers once thick with shells and coral fragments suddenly thinning into emptiness. The sudden absence is as telling as any presence, a silence written into stone. What makes this catastrophe haunting is not just the scale of loss, but the speed of it. In deep time, millions of years can pass like breaths, but even on that scale, the Ordovician extinction was rapid. Ecosystems did not have time to adjust, to evolve new defenses or strategies. The freeze struck, the flood followed, and in between, stability never returned. For life, it was like being battered by waves too strong and too close together, with no chance to catch breath between them. And yet, through this devastation, life did not end. Pockets of survivors clung to existence, scattered in places where conditions remained tolerable. They endured not because they were strongest, but because they were lucky, or flexible, or small enough to hide in the cracks left behind. From those remnants, the story of life would continue. But for the countless species erased by the 1 to 2 blow of ice and flood, their chapter in Earth's history closed forever, their voices preserved only in stone. The story of the Ordovician extinction is not told by witnesses, for no eyes then could have seen the full scale of what was happening. It is written instead in stone, in sediments pressed and layered over hundreds of millions of years. The Earth itself holds the memory of those frozen seas, those vanishing reefs, and those flooded coasts, and it leaves us clues to piece together the silent catastrophe. Across what was once the southern supercontinent of Gondwana, geologists have uncovered glacial deposits that speak of the great sheets of ice. These are not ordinary rocks, but layers filled with telltale signs of glaciers grinding across the land. Pebbles and boulders scraped into place by slow rivers of ice are preserved in hardened sediments, scattered in patterns that no river or wind could have created. Dropstones, heavy rocks carried within glaciers and released into the sea as the ice melted, lie embedded in ancient mudstones, frozen moments of icebergs crumbling into cold waters. These scattered stones are fragments of the glaciers themselves, the fingerprints of a vanished ice age. The chemistry of the rocks holds more secrets still. Scientists study the isotopes of oxygen locked within ancient sediments to measure changes in temperature across deep time. In the Ordovician layers, a sharp rise in oxygen isotopes reveals a sudden cooling, the unmistakable signal of glaciation spreading across Gondwana. Later, just as abruptly, those signals swing back, marking the melting of ice and the surge of warmth that followed. These chemical shifts are the echoes of climates that swung violently, freezing and flooding the world in quick succession. Fossils, too, speak of the devastation. In some layers of stone, trilobites and brachiopods appear in rich abundance, their shells filling every inch of the rock. Then, suddenly, they are gone. Entire species disappear between one layer and the next, erased not slowly, but all at once. This stark line, where diversity falls silent, is the boundary of catastrophe. In different parts of the world, from North America to Europe to China, the story repeats itself. Rich fossil beds taper into emptiness, broken only by the modest remains of a few survivors. The rocks record the collapse of ecosystems with a clarity that words alone cannot carry. Sediment cores drilled from ancient seafloors show the chaos in finer detail. In these cores, layers are stacked like pages of a book, each one capturing a moment in Earth's history. Within the Ordovician chapters, we see the fingerprints of shifting currents and collapsing food webs. Layers of dark shale, rich in organic matter, suggest times when oxygen vanished from the seas, suffocating life in the depths. Lenses of coarse material reveal torrents of sediment poured into the oceans by melting glaciers, smothering habitats in sudden floods. Chemical spikes, abrupt and sharp, reveal disruptions in carbon cycles that shook the foundation of marine life. Together, these traces form a tapestry of catastrophe. The glacial deposits tell us of ice advancing across Gondwana. The isotopes whisper of temperatures plunging, then rising again. Fossil beds map the silence of extinction, while sediment cores preserve the chaos of floods, suffocation, and sudden shifts. They are not just records of stone, but voices from an ancient world, carrying across nearly 500 million years to tell us what unfolded when Earth faced its first great dying. And yet, even as the rocks record collapse, they also carry the signs of continuity. After the silence, new fossils appear, fragile survivors stepping into the gaps left behind. The cores show cycles beginning again, currents stabilizing, reefs inching toward rebirth. The evidence reminds us that extinction is both an end and a beginning, and that even in chaos, life endures. From these ancient layers, scientists reconstruct not only the story of loss, but also the resilience of life on a planet that has weathered catastrophe time and again. And in the stillness that followed the Ordovician collapse, the oceans themselves seemed emptied of their giants, waiting for new forms to rise into the spaces left behind. The rocks tell us of ice and flood, of reefs collapsing and species disappearing, but they also tell us of what came next. After the violence of the Ordovician extinction, the oceans were changed into places of haunting emptiness. Where once they had brimmed with trilobites in their thousands, with corals stacked into reefs and predators drifting like spears, the seas now lay quiet. The great noise of life had been hushed, leaving only fragments of what had been. The giants were gone. The straight-shelled cephalopods that had once ruled the waters drifted into obscurity, their numbers cut so deeply that they no longer commanded the oceans. The reefs that had risen as fortresses of biodiversity were shattered and silent, their stones broken and their builders vanished. Trilobite lineages that had marched across every continent dwindled, some reduced to sparse survivors, others erased completely. The great shoals of fish that had begun their rise were scattered, their numbers too few to dominate. What remained were oceans that felt like ghosts of themselves. The layers of sediment from this time show gaps, great absences where life should have been. In place of dense fossil beds filled with corals, crinoids, and trilobites, there are thinner seams with only a handful of shells. The silence is written not only in the disappearance of species, but in the scarcity of remains left behind. It is as though the oceans themselves had been hollowed out, leaving space that would take millions of years to fill again. For the creatures that endured, survival was slow and precarious. Generalists lingered where they could, taking refuge in the less disrupted parts of the seas. Scavengers combed the sediments for scraps, feeding on whatever fragments remained. Cold-water species spread cautiously into new habitats, finding opportunity in emptiness. But this was not recovery. Not yet. It was persistence in a world that had been stripped of its richness. Imagine the Ordovician seas in the aftermath. Vast stretches of water shimmered beneath the same dim sunlight, but without the swarms of trilobites that had once carpeted the floor. Coral reefs lay toppled, their skeletons broken into rubble. The once dominant predators, the long-bodied orthocones, drifted rarely and without confidence, their dominance forever broken. The ecosystems that had flourished in such complexity were now reduced to shadows, their intricate webs of dependence cut down to only the simplest strands. Time in deep history moves differently than we know it. To us, the silence of a few years feels unbearable, but for the earth, silence stretched for millions upon millions of years after the first great dying. It was not the silence of total emptiness, but the quiet of scarcity, of small survivors spreading cautiously into spaces that had once been overflowing with competition. Each step toward recovery was measured and fragile, vulnerable to collapse at any moment. The reefs, once the proud citadels of Ordovician biodiversity, did not rebuild quickly. Their architects were gone, and the ecosystems that supported them had been dismantled. It would be millions of years before reefs returned to anything resembling their former glory. The trilobites that persisted were diminished, their great variety reduced to a few surviving branches. Even the small armored fish, whose lineage would one day give rise to giants, remained modest and hidden, waiting for time to grant them opportunity. This slow return is etched into the rocks as well. After the sharp silence of the extinction layers, fossils begin to appear again, but thinly at first. A few brachiopods here, a scattering of trilobites there, traces of crinoids and bryozoans cautiously re-emerging. It was not a sudden bloom, but a long and patient rebuilding, as if the earth itself had to catch its breath after the devastation. The Ordovician seas remind us that recovery is rarely quick, even for life itself. Diversity had once risen to heights never before seen, only to be cut down by ice and flood. What followed was not a triumphant resurgence, but a whisper, a slow gathering of fragments into fragile new beginnings. The silence after the fall was deep, and its echoes would shape the oceans for ages to come. And in this quiet world, as survivors clung to existence, evolution prepared the next steps, for even in devastation, the story of life never truly stops. In the wake of devastation, when reefs had fallen silent and the giants of the oceans were gone, the story of life did not end. It shifted into a quieter rhythm, a slow rebuilding that unfolded across millions of years. From the silence left behind by extinction, survivors began to spread cautiously into the empty spaces. Each small step was a thread in a vast tapestry of renewal, weaving a future that would one day restore the oceans to richness once more. The early fish were among the first to seize these opportunities. Though still small and armored in bony plates, they began to radiate into habitats that had been left vacant by the fall of trilobites and corals. With so many predators gone, the seas were less dangerous, allowing these pioneers to expand into roles they had not held before. Some darted through open waters, grazing on plankton and soft-bodied organisms, while others clung to seafloors, using their plated heads as shields against the shifting sands. Their diversity grew slowly, but in their persistence lay the beginnings of a revolution that would one day transform the oceans entirely. The reefs, once shattered into rubble, found new builders rising to take the place of those that had vanished. Sponges, crinoids, and other encrusting organisms began to colonize rocky surfaces, layer upon layer, forming the foundation for ecosystems that would support countless species. Though these reefs were smaller and less complex than their Ordovician predecessors, they were signs of recovery. In the shallow seas, new structures grew upward toward the light, offering refuge for small creatures, hiding places for larvae, and feeding grounds for fish. Life was stitching itself back into patterns of interdependence, Evolution thrives in moments of emptiness. When extinction clears away specialists, it opens doors for survivors to step through, to adapt in ways that would have been impossible in a crowded world. Generalists, those flexible species that had endured by tolerating change, began to experiment with new forms. Some trilobites shrank in size, evolving into simpler, more resilient shapes that required fewer resources. Certain brachiopods, diminished but not gone, spread across wider ranges, tolerating colder or more variable conditions. These adaptations were not about flourishing in abundance, but about holding steady in a world that was still fragile. In the sediments of this time, the fossils show not the silence of extinction, but the first hesitant return of diversity. Shells appear again, thin at first, then more common in layers above. Coral fragments re-emerge, alongside the skeletons of crinoids and the delicate frameworks of bryozoans. Fish fossils, once rare, begin to appear more often, hinting at their growing role in the recovering seas. Each find is a trace of persistence, of life continuing to search for stability in an unstable world. The oceans themselves remained different. Currents had shifted, climates still fluctuated, and ecosystems took millions of years to stabilize. Yet this very instability offered opportunities for innovation. The survivors of the Ordovician were not simply repeating what had come before. They were experimenting with new forms of survival, laying the groundwork for the next chapters of evolution. The early jawed fish, modest as they were, began to refine their weapons, setting the stage for predators that would one day dominate. The small reef builders laid the foundation for new ecological hubs that would anchor the biodiversity of future ages. To picture this rebuilding is to imagine oceans still quieter than they once were, but no longer empty. In shallow waters, clusters of sponges and corals rise like small fortresses from the rubble. Between them, armored fish weave cautiously, searching for food. Trilobites, fewer than before but still present, scuttle across the seafloor, leaving trails in the sediment. Above, currents carry plankton, nourishing the simplest life that fuels the rest. It is not the golden age reborn, but the faint beginning of something new. The Ordovician extinction had cleared the oceans, silencing species that had seemed eternal. But from that silence came renewal, slow and uneven, yet steady. Life had been wounded deeply, but it endured. With each survivor that spread into a new niche, with each reef that grew from fresh foundations, the earth was writing the next lines of its story. And in time, these quiet survivors would give rise to even greater marvels, carrying the history of resilience forward into ages still to come. Among the most striking symbols of the Ordovician seas were the trilobites. For more than 100 million years before the extinction, they had flourished in almost every marine habitat. Their armored bodies, jointed legs, and crystal eyes made them versatile, and they branched into thousands of species, each with its own design. Some bore long spines like thorns, others flattened themselves like living shields, while many carried patterns of ridges and curves as intricate as any modern shell. In the golden age before the collapse, trilobites had been everywhere, carpeting seafloors and filling the ecosystems of reefs and shallow waters. But after the 1-2 strike of ice and flood, they were never the same again. The survivors that remained were reduced in both number and variety. Where once there had been great diversity, with lineages spreading into every available niche, only a fraction persisted. These survivors tended to be smaller and simpler, stripped of the extravagant adaptations that had marked their heyday. The great swarming communities that had once marched across sediments in uncountable numbers were replaced by scattered individuals, their trails faint and few in the layers of stone that followed. The decline was not immediate disappearance, but a slow fading. Trilobites continued into the Silurian and Devonian, and even beyond, but their variety had been diminished by the Ordovician collapse. They no longer radiated with the same evolutionary energy. The great experimentation of form that had once defined them was muted, their designs narrowing into fewer possibilities. Some of the most elaborate groups, with long spines or delicate ornamentation, were gone forever. Those that remained were sturdier, generalist forms that could survive in colder or less stable seas. This change marked the beginning of a long decline. Though trilobites would persist for another 250 million years, the Ordovician extinction foreshadowed their eventual fate. They had once been the unrivaled rulers of the seafloor, but from this point onward, they were increasingly overshadowed by other creatures. Fish, both jawless and jawed, expanded into roles trilobites had once filled. Corals and other reef builders created new habitats where trilobites played smaller roles. The oceans were evolving toward futures where trilobites were no longer at the center. The fossil record captures this shift in haunting detail. Before the extinction, trilobites appear in rich variety, their shells forming layers upon layers of abundance. After, the record thins. Fewer species, smaller bodies, and simpler shapes dominate the stone. The once diverse array of trilobite eyes, built from crystals of calcite, became less common, their visual complexity reduced. Even their behaviors changed, with fewer signs of mass swarming or elaborate burrowing patterns. It is as though the extinction had pressed them into smaller lives, leaving them unable to reclaim the glory they once held. To imagine the seafloor after this turning point is to see emptier landscapes where trilobites scuttle in isolation, their shells modest, their movements cautious. The great herds that once left carpets of trails across the mud are gone. What remains are smaller species, eking out existence in the quieter aftermath, part of the rebuilding but no longer the architects of abundance. They survived, but survival is not the same as thriving. Their eventual extinction, hundreds of millions of years later, was still far in the future, but the seeds of it were sown in this moment. The Ordovician extinction revealed their vulnerabilities, their reliance on specific habitats, their slower pace of innovation compared to other rising groups, and their diminishing diversity made them increasingly fragile in the ages that followed. The giants of their lineage had fallen, and their descendants carried only echoes of their former power. Yet even in their decline, trilobites remain among the most evocative symbols of early life. Their fossils, often preserved with exquisite detail, remind us of a time when they ruled the seas with unmatched variety. They are markers of both abundance and fragility, of life's capacity to flourish and its vulnerability to collapse. In their long story, the Ordovician extinction stands as the chapter that bent their trajectory downward, turning what had once been triumph into the slow fade that would end in silence. And as trilobites dwindled, other creatures stepped forward, rising into the spaces they left behind, ensuring that the oceans would continue to evolve in ways the trilobites could never reclaim. The Ordovician extinction carved deep wounds into the oceans, silencing reefs, thinning trilobite swarms, and toppling predators that had once seemed untouchable. Yet as profound as the loss was, it also marked a turning point in the larger story of life. Mass extinctions are tragedies written across deep time, but they are also engines of change. By sweeping away what once dominated, they clear space for the unexpected, for new creatures to rise and new ecosystems to form. The Ordovician collapse is one of the clearest examples of this process. In the golden age before the ice, Life had filled nearly every niche the oceans could provide. Coral reefs stretched high, trilobites ruled the seafloors, and cephalopods stalked the open waters. It was a world of abundance, but also of limits. Specialists thrived, locked into narrow roles that left little room for innovation. Ecosystems had become crowded, their hierarchies well established. Then, in a span of just a few million years, the freeze and flood shattered those balances, and abundance turned into emptiness. For the survivors, emptiness became opportunity. Generalists that endured the collapse were free to spread into niches once occupied by specialists. Small-jawed fish, modest and unassuming before, began to expand into territories vacated by fallen predators. Reef communities, reduced to rubble, slowly drew new builders like sponges and corals that constructed different kinds of ecosystems. Even humble burrowers, creatures that tunneled through sediments in search of food, grew in importance, their presence reshaping the chemistry of the seafloor. This pattern would repeat throughout Earth's history. The Permian extinction, hundreds of millions of years later, would sweep away more than 90% of species, but in its wake, reptiles and eventually mammals would take on roles denied to them before. The Cretaceous extinction, sparked by an asteroid, would erase the dinosaurs, but create room for birds and mammals to flourish. In each case, collapse was not only an ending, but a reset, a clearing of the board that forced evolution into new directions. The Ordovician event showed this principle for the first time. Without its collapse, the cephalopods may have remained unchallenged for far longer, their dominance delaying the rise of fish. Trilobites, once endlessly inventive, might have continued to crowd out other groups, preventing new forms from finding footholds. Instead, the extinction cut them down, and into that silence stepped the seeds of future lineages. The slow radiation of fish, the cautious rebuilding of reefs, and the spread of generalists all trace their roots back to the gaps left behind. This is the paradox of extinction. It brings devastation to the life that exists, yet it creates the conditions for new life to emerge. It is destruction, but also renewal. The rocks hold both sides of the story. The abrupt disappearance of species, and just above it, the faint return of diversity as survivors begin to shape something new. To imagine this reset is to see the oceans in two phases. First, the silence after collapse, when empty waters stretched over ghostly reefs, and the few survivors drifted through scarcity. Then, the slow stirring of recovery, as those same survivors expanded cautiously into new spaces, experimenting with shapes and strategies that would not have been possible before. From devastation came novelty, from loss came innovation. Extinction has always been a force of creative destruction in deep time. It is not gentle nor forgiving, but it is part of the rhythm of life on Earth. Without collapse, ecosystems grow rigid, filled to their limits, with little room for change. With collapse, space opens, and evolution seizes it, pushing survivors into new roles, shaping worlds that could not have existed otherwise. The Ordovician extinction reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of Earth's story, the thread of life continues, not in the same form, but in new ones, and in the spaces carved by loss, the foundations of future wonders are quietly laid. The story of the Ordovician extinction is not just a distant tale written in stone, it is also a mirror, reflecting truths that reach across nearly 500 million years to touch the present. For while the creatures of that age were unlike anything alive today, the forces that shaped their fate are ones we still live with. Climate, oceans, and the fragile balance of ecosystems under stress. In the Ordovician, Ice was the first great disruptor. Gondwana's drift into polar latitudes pulled the world into a sudden freeze. Vast glaciers locked away water, seas drained, and habitats that had seemed eternal were exposed and destroyed. Then, in a violent reversal, the melting of those glaciers drowned what had survived, overwhelming ecosystems with a flood of change. Life had little time to adjust. Those that could not tolerate rapid swings in climate were lost. When we look at the world today, we see different causes, but the echoes remain. The ice that spreads now is melting, not advancing. Instead of glaciers grinding across the land, they are retreating at speeds measured in decades. Sea levels rise not because Gondwana has drifted across the pole, but because greenhouse gases warm the planet more quickly than ecosystems can adapt. It is the pace that is most striking. The Ordovician shifts took place across millions of years, long stretches of time that, even in their violence, were measured in slow motion compared to the speed of human-driven change. Today, shifts of equal magnitude are unfolding in centuries, and in some places, within single lifetimes. The lesson written in deep history is clear. Ecosystems are resilient when change is gradual, but they are fragile when change is rapid. In the Ordovician, reefs collapsed when seas withdrew, and then again when floods surged back. Today, coral reefs bleach under sudden heat, their symbiotic algae expelled in days, their structures weakened in years. In the Ordovician, trilobites dwindled when their narrow niches were stripped away. Today, countless species face similar losses as warming seas, shifting currents, and disrupted climates erase the stability they depend on. What is haunting is how often the story repeats itself. The Ordovician was only the first of Earth's great extinctions. Others followed. The Permian, when nearly all life was lost to fire, heat, and poisoned seas, and the Cretaceous, when an asteroid ended the age of dinosaurs. Each one shows the same truth in different forms. Stability is precious, and when it breaks, life changes in ways that cannot be undone. For us, the question is not whether life will endure, for history shows that it always does. The question is what life will look like when the shift has passed. In the Ordovician, 90 out of every 100 species vanished. Survivors endured. But the oceans that followed were not the same as those that came before. In our time, the worry is not only about reefs and fish, but also about the countless connections that link ecosystems together, from forests to rivers to seas. The rocks whisper a warning. They tell us that rapid shifts in climate unravel the most complex systems first, those that have taken millions of years to build. Reefs fall, food webs fracture, and giants collapse under their own demands. In their place come new survivors, smaller, more adaptable, but not always the ones we expect or rely upon. The Ordovician reminds us that once the thread is broken, recovery is measured not in decades or centuries, but in millions of years. Yet these rocks also remind us of resilience. Life does endure. After the Ordovician collapse, fish spread, reefs rebounded, and ecosystems eventually flourished again, though in different forms. The story is one of loss, but also of renewal. For us, the challenge is to recognize the fragility before collapse forces renewal upon us. We stand not outside of these patterns, but within them. Our species is part of Earth's history, and what we choose to do shapes how this chapter will be remembered. And as we follow the arc of ancient extinctions, we begin to see how each one is unique, how each carries its own cause, its own silence, and its own aftermath. The Ordovician freeze and flood was only the first, a quiet catastrophe of ice, while others would roar with fire and impact. The Ordovician extinction was the first of Earth's great collapses, but it would not be the last. In the billions of years since life began, the planet has suffered 5 mass extinctions, each one wiping away much of what had flourished before. Each was devastating, yet each was also different, shaped by forces as varied as ice, fire, and stone falling from the sky. Together, they reveal the many ways Earth can test the resilience of life, and how fragile even the strongest ecosystems can be when the balance tips. The Ordovician extinction stands apart as a quiet catastrophe driven by ice and water. It began when Gondwana shifted across the South Pole and glaciers spread across the land. Cold gripped the planet, seas retreated, and the shallow waters that had supported reefs and trilobite swarms dried away. Then, in a sudden reversal, the glaciers melted and seas surged back, flooding ecosystems that had only just begun to recover. The 1 to 2 strike of freeze and flood erased nearly 90% of all species, leaving oceans hollowed out. It was devastation not by fire or impact, but by climate alone, an icy hand closing and then loosening too quickly. Hundreds of millions of years later, another extinction would test life in a very different way. The Permian extinction, often called the Great Dying, was Earth's most severe catastrophe. Unlike the Ordovician's icy silence, the Permian roared with fire and heat. Vast volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia released torrents of lava and immense quantities of gases into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide levels soared, the planet warmed, and oceans became poisoned by anoxia and acidification. The very chemistry of the seas changed, suffocating life from the smallest plankton to the largest predators. More than 90% of marine species and 70% of land species were lost. Where the Ordovician had frozen and flooded the world, the Permian burned it and choked it, leaving a silence even deeper, a pause so severe that it took tens of millions of years for life to recover. Then came the Cretaceous extinction, the most famous of them all, when a single event ended the reign of the dinosaurs. 66 million years ago, an asteroid several miles wide struck the Yucatan Peninsula with energy greater than millions of nuclear weapons. The impact sent shock waves racing across the planet, set forests aflame, and threw enough dust and ash into the sky to block sunlight for months. Photosynthesis faltered, food chains collapsed, and ecosystems unraveled in weeks and years rather than millennia. 3/4 of species vanished, including the non-avian dinosaurs that had ruled the land for more than 100 million years. Unlike the long chill of the Ordovician or the fiery agony of the Permian, the Cretaceous was sudden, a single strike from the heavens, reshaping the course of evolution forever. When we compare these 3 great extinctions, their uniqueness becomes clear. The Ordovician was slow but relentless, a catastrophe of ice and flood that unfolded across millions of years. The Permian was drawn out but suffocating, a long burn of volcanic fury that poisoned air and sea. The Cretaceous was instantaneous, a single impact that ended entire dynasties in a geological blink. Each event was different, but each carved deeply into the tree of life, pruning branches that had seemed unshakable. What sets the Ordovician apart is its quietness. There were no roaring volcanoes, no fiery skies, no sudden asteroid strikes. Instead, it was the planet's own shifting balance, the movement of continents, and the tilt of climates that unraveled the abundance of the oceans. Its silence is haunting, for it reminds us that catastrophe does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it comes softly, as ice spreading slowly across land, as seas withdrawing grain by grain, as habitats shrinking until they cannot sustain what depends on them. It was devastation without spectacle, yet it ended nearly 9 out of every 10 species. And just as the Permian reset life on land and the Cretaceous cleared the way for mammals to rise, the Ordovician reset the oceans. From its icy silence came the survivors that would one day give rise to fish empires, new reefs, and lineages that lead to us. Each extinction, though unique, served as both ending and beginning, shaping the story of life in ways no single species could control. The Ordovician extinction reminds us that the Earth is not a place of endless stability. It is a planet balanced on edges, where even small changes can tip the scale toward catastrophe. At first glance, the shifts of that age might not seem extraordinary. A continent drifted south, ice spread across its surface, seas retreated, then returned. Yet those changes, subtle when measured against the immensity of geological time, were enough to unravel nearly all of the life that had flourished in the oceans. It was a lesson written in deep history that the balance of life and climate is more delicate than it appears. The Ordovician seas had been warm, shallow, and filled with richness. Trilobites swarmed, reefs grew tall, and predators drifted like shadows. But as Gondwana shifted toward the South Pole, glaciers began to grow. Their expansion locked away vast amounts of water, lowering sea levels and stripping habitats bare. When those glaciers melted, the waters rushed back, drowning what had survived. The swings in climate, driven by movements of rock and ice, were not monumental explosions or sudden collisions. They were shifts measured in temperature and water, yet they carried consequences that were catastrophic. This fragility is not unique to the Ordovician. Earth's history is filled with tipping points, moments when balance was lost and life changed irreversibly. In the Permian, a rise in carbon dioxide tipped oceans into suffocating anoxia. In the Cretaceous, the dust of an asteroid blocked sunlight long enough to collapse food chains. Each time, the world seemed robust, filled with abundance, until the point was crossed and stability was gone. The systems that sustain life, from climate to chemistry, are intricate webs, and once those webs are torn, recovery takes millions of years. To imagine this fragility is to think of the oceans like a finely tuned instrument. A change in one string alters the harmony of the whole. A small drop in temperature can freeze shallow seas. A small rise can bleach reefs into silence. A slight shift in currents can starve one part of the ocean while flooding another with nutrients. Life adjusts when changes are gradual, but when the pace accelerates, the web unravels. The Ordovician shows that even in an ancient world filled only with marine creatures, the same truth held: small shifts had massive consequences. This is the paradox of stability in deep time. For millions of years, the Earth can appear steady, climates holding within a narrow band, ecosystems filling with diversity, species evolving into ever more intricate designs. Yet beneath that calm lies the potential for sudden change. A drifting continent, a shift in orbit, a fluctuation in carbon or oxygen, and the balance tips. When it does, it is not only one species or one region that feels it, but entire oceans, entire worlds of life. The fragility of balance is also what drives the rhythm of evolution. Extinction clears, recovery rebuilds, and in the spaces carved by collapse, new forms emerge. But this cycle comes at a cost. The Ordovician oceans lost 9 out of every 10 species, a toll so vast it is difficult to comprehend. The balance that had allowed their abundance was broken, and once broken, it could not be restored to what it had been. Life did return, but it returned differently, built on the fragments of what had survived. Even today, the echoes of this fragility remain. Our climate, our oceans, and our ecosystems are all bound to the same principles that shaped the Ordovician. A rise or fall in temperature by only a few degrees can transform weather, shift currents, and erase habitats. Just as the glaciers of Gondwana tipped the world into extinction, so too can the small accumulations of change in our own age alter the course of life. The story of the Ordovician is not just about ancient seas and lost trilobites. It is a reminder that Earth's stability has always been fragile, its balance delicate, and its tipping points closer than they appear. And in that fragility lies both the danger of collapse and the possibility of renewal, threads that have carried life forward across the ages. In the silence that followed the Ordovician extinction, the oceans felt empty, their once bustling ecosystems stripped to shadows of what they had been. But time, patient and unyielding, slowly stitched new patterns into the void. Millions of years passed, and with them, survivors began to spread, adapt, and diversify. From this slow, fragile recovery came the first stirrings of a new age, the Silurian, a chapter where life began to rise again and the oceans regained some of their lost vibrancy. The reefs, long shattered, were among the first to return. Their Ordovician architects had collapsed in the ice and flood, but new builders stepped forward. Corals, both solitary and colonial, began to flourish once more, joined by stromatoporoids, sponge-like organisms that layered themselves into solid mounds. Together, they created living fortresses of stone and skeleton, pushing upward toward the light and outward across the shallow seas. These reefs grew into vast habitats, sheltering small creatures and weaving new webs of interdependence. What had once been rubble became nurseries of life again, fragile yet persistent, a rebirth of the ocean's most enduring ecosystems. The seafloors, once sparsely populated, filled again with familiar figures. Trilobites, diminished but not gone, returned to crawl across the sediments. They were fewer and less diverse than before, yet their trails once again marked the mud. Brachiopods spread their shells across the seabed, anchoring themselves to rock and reef alike. Crinoids waved their feathered arms in the currents, filtering food from the waters that grew richer with plankton. Even the simplest of burrowers carved channels beneath the surface, cycling nutrients and preparing the ground for more complex communities. But the most transformative change of the Silurian seas came from the fish. In the Ordovician, they had been small and humble, armored with bony plates, without jaws to bite or fins to steer with strength. Yet in the new age, they began to expand into roles no creature had filled before. The first jawed fish emerged, their mouths armed with primitive but powerful jaws that allowed them to grasp and tear prey. It was a leap in design that would echo through the rest of evolution, for jaws opened doors to predation that had never existed in earlier seas. From these beginnings, fish began to spread into every available niche. Some remained small, feeding on plankton or sifting through sediment, while others grew larger, their armor thickened, their movements more agile. They became hunters in their own right, no longer confined to scavenging or grazing, but capable of challenging even the lingering cephalopods. Though the oceans were still in recovery, the rise of jawed fish marked a profound shift, hinting at a future where vertebrates would ascend as the dominant predators of the sea. The ecosystems that reformed in the Silurian were not identical to those that had been lost. They were new mosaics, built from the survivors of the Ordovician mixed with the innovators of the Silurian. Reefs hosted corals that were different from those that had once dominated. Fish radiated into forms that had no counterparts in earlier times. Trilobites, though still present, no longer commanded the same variety, instead inhabiting more modest roles in the web of life. It was not a simple restoration of what had been, but the birth of something new, shaped by loss yet also by opportunity. To picture the Silurian seas is to see reefs rising like submerged cities, their structures crowded with life. Small fish weave among coral branches, their scales glinting in filtered light. Larger armored fish patrol the open waters, their jaws snapping at softer prey. Cephalopods, still present, glide through the currents, though no longer unmatched. Brachiopods cluster along the rocky floor, while crinoids sway gently, capturing food with their delicate arms. Above it all, plankton drifts, fueling the chain of life that has begun once more to climb toward abundance. This return was not immediate, nor was it complete, but it marked a turning of the tide. The silence of the Ordovician gave way to the cautious hum of new ecosystems. The reefs rose again, fish sharpened their weapons, and the oceans filled with voices that had been missing for millions of years. The resilience of life had carried it through, transforming emptiness into renewal and setting the stage for even greater innovations yet to come. The Ordovician seas had once belonged to the cephalopods. The straight-shelled orthocones drifted like living spears, their tentacles lashing prey, their dominance unrivaled for millions of years. They had been the apex predators, elegant and terrifying, ruling oceans that covered most of the earth. But extinction had changed the order. The ice and flood that silenced reefs and erased countless species had also fractured the rule of the orthocones. By the time the Silurian seas came alive again, their grip had weakened. They were still there, haunting the waters with their long shells and jet-powered bursts of speed, but their era of supremacy had passed. The once abundant lineages of straight-shelled hunters were reduced, their variety diminished, their numbers thinned. Those that remained were smaller and less imposing than their ancestors. Where once they had commanded the seas with overwhelming presence, they now shared them with rivals who were growing stronger by the generation. Those rivals were the fish. In the Ordovician, they had been modest creatures, jawless and armored, surviving at the edges of ecosystems dominated by trilobites and cephalopods. But in the Silurian, with niches emptied by extinction and predators weakened, fish began their great ascent. The first jaws had already appeared, transforming these once humble vertebrates into hunters. With jaws came the power to grasp, to tear, and to feed on prey larger than before. It was a tool so effective that it reshaped the course of life, giving vertebrates an edge that would carry them forward for hundreds of millions of years. As fish diversified, they spread into waters once ruled by cephalopods. Some developed heavy armor, their heads and bodies encased in plates of bone, protection against attacks and weapons for their own strikes. Others became more agile, their fins more refined, allowing them to dart through reefs and open waters with precision. They experimented with size, with diet, with strategies of survival. In time, they grew into predators that could rival and eventually surpass the once dominant orthocones. The balance of power in the seas shifted slowly but decisively. Cephalopods no longer reigned as the unchallenged giants of the deep. Fish began to fill the roles of top predator, driving the arms race of evolution into new territory. With vertebrate jaws snapping shut and armored bodies charging forward, the oceans were no longer the domain of invertebrates alone. A new dynasty was beginning, and it belonged to the vertebrates. The fossil record captures this transition with striking clarity. After the Ordovician, cephalopod shells become less common, their diversity waning. In contrast, fish fossils multiply, their forms branching into new groups, each with its own adaptations. The rise of placoderms, the heavily armored fish of the Silurian and Devonian, marks the turning of the tide. These formidable animals, with jaws strong enough to crush bone, were unlike anything that had come before. They were the heralds of a new empire. To imagine these seas is to see two worlds overlapping. The lingering orthocones drift silently, relics of an earlier age, their shells casting long shadows across the reefs. But around them swim fish of growing power, armored hunters and swift swimmers, their presence more numerous, their designs more innovative. The oceans are no longer held in the grip of a single lineage. They are becoming vertebrate seas, their balance shifting toward creatures that will one day dominate not only water, but land and sky as well. This moment in deep time was not merely a change in species, but a shift in destiny. The decline of cephalopods opened the way for vertebrates to rise, and in their rise lay the seeds of the future. From these early fish would come sharks, rays, bony fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Every jaw that snaps today, every vertebrate that swims or walks or flies, can trace its story back to this ancient shift. The sea monsters of the Ordovician had ruled with silence and strength, but their time had passed. The fish, once fragile and overlooked, had seized the future. The oceans were theirs now, and from their empire would grow the next great chapters of life on Earth. The story of the Ordovician is the story of a world that feels at once alien and familiar. It was an age long before dinosaurs, before mammals, before even the first insect took flight. The Earth was almost entirely ocean, a planet ruled not by creatures of the land, but by monsters of the sea. Straight-shelled cephalopods hunted like living missiles. Trilobites with crystal eyes marched across the seafloor in their thousands. Coral reefs rose for the first time, becoming fortresses of life. And then, in the quiet turning of climate, nearly all of it was undone. It was the first great dying, the earliest reminder that even in its youth, Earth's balance was fragile. Ice advanced, seas withdrew, and habitats vanished. When the ice melted, floods erased what little remained. Nearly 9 out of every 10 species disappeared, their lineages cut short, their designs lost forever, and yet life endured. In the aftermath, survivors spread again, fish rose into predators, and reefs were rebuilt stone by stone. Out of loss came renewal, and out of silence came voices that would shape the oceans for millions of years to come. What we remember of this age does not come from memory, but from fossils. The rocks preserve their whispers, pressed into stone over nearly 500 million years. Orthocone shells, long and elegant, lying frozen in ancient sediments, trilobites with their fine ridges and perfect eyes etched with astonishing clarity. Coral fragments that speak of reefs, once alive with color, now reduced to pale stone. Each fossil is a message across time, a fragment of a world that no longer exists, yet still reaches us in silence. They tell us of abundance, of collapse, and of survival. When we hold those fossils in our imagination, the Ordovician is not forgotten. It comes alive again as alien seas filled with predators and prey, as ecosystems bursting with strange beauty, as a planet that was both fragile and enduring. Though its creatures are gone, its lessons remain, written into every layer of stone and every survivor that followed. And there is something humbling in remembering that we ourselves belong to this story. We are not separate from deep time. We are descendants of survivors, children of those who endured the ice and flood of Earth's first great extinction. The vertebrates that would one day walk on land and eventually evolve into us trace their lineage back to those armored fish that swam in the Silurian seas after the Ordovician collapse. Without their endurance, without their persistence in a broken world, our own story would never have begun. The Ordovician is a reminder that Earth has always been fragile. Its balance can be broken by shifts in climate, by movements of rock, by the slow tilting of continents across the globe. Yet it is also a reminder of endurance. Even after the first great dying, life returned, not in the same forms, but in new ones, each shaped by what had been lost and what had survived. Fragility and resilience, woven together, are the rhythm of our planet. So as we drift away from the alien seas of the Ordovician, we carry with us a gentle truth. The world has ended many times, yet it has always begun again. The monsters of that forgotten age are gone, but their echoes remain in every fish, every reef, and in us. Fossils whisper of what once was, and in their silence they remind us that even in the face of catastrophe, Earth endures. And in that thought lies a kind of calm, a reassurance, shaped across 500 million years. Life has always been fragile, yet it has always found a way to continue. The deadly age before dinosaurs may be forgotten by most, but in stone, in science, and in the breath of the present, it is never truly lost.